Welcome to the African News Review podcast, where we cut through the noise and get to the truth. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and each week we are here to challenge the biases, prejudices, and misinformation in the Western press about Africa. Using historical context and contemporary insights, we set the record straight and reclaim the narrative. Tune in every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we uncover the real stories and reshape the conversations about Africa. This is the African News Review podcast, reclaiming Africa's narrative, one story at a time. Yes, good day, good afternoon, good morning, and greetings wherever you're hearing us at the moment. Welcome to another episode of African News Review. I'm your host, Adesoji Iginla, and with me, as usual, is comrade in thoughts and arms. He's a journalist, a broadcaster with Black Star News. He is comrade Milton Allimadi. His book, How Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in the Western Media, inspired this program. Welcome, comrade. Yes. It's been the usual week in the press, and we are here again to break down the coverage of Africa in the Western media. And for our first story, we'll go to the heart of Africa, the Congo. And in the Congo, we have a story reaching us from Radio France International, and it is titled, Congo Seeks Justice and Reparation from Rwanda's Role in Conflict. The lead reads, the Democratic Republic of Congo has brought a case against Rwanda to the East African Court of Justice, accusing it of violating its sovereignty and national integrity in the volatile Eastern DRC. The court's first task is to determine if it has jurisdiction over the case. From the RFI goes on, it says, the DRC represented by Samuel Mbemba, Deputy Minister of Justice and Legal Affairs, is seeking to condemn Rwanda for alleged aggression in the region, including looting, rapes, and massacres. Kinshasa, which is the capital of the DRC, hopes to secure reparations from Kigali, again the capital of Rwanda. A preliminary hearing was held on Thursday in the court in Arusha, Tanzania. In response, Rwanda's Foreign Minister, Olivier Nduhungirehe, said the DRC should first focus on delivering justice to the victims of the FARDC, the Armed Forces of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and those of the FDLR, the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, a rebel group opposed to the Rwandan government, before giving lessons on justice. He goes on to criticize what he described as media and judicial posturing and constant insults from the Congolese Minister for Justice, directed at Rwanda's President Paul Kagame. In addition to the East African Court, Rwanda faces charges before the African Court on Human and People's Rights. These actions are part of the DRC's broader effort to hold Rwanda accountable for regional stability. Your initial thoughts?
Well, of course, I support it 100%. The story actually, I think, goes further to say, which I was not aware of, that it's also trying to get the IC?
ICC,
to expedite the process. But there was no mention of the ICJ, because the ICJ, as we discussed in one of the previous shows here, found Uganda liable for similar atrocities against the DRC, Congo, in 2005. And at that time awarded Congo reparations of $10 billion, 6 to 10 billion. But they negotiated over the years. It was dropped down to, I think, about maybe 400 million, which Uganda has already started paying. So I think maybe Congo wants to do it another way around this time. If it has not already initiated at the ICJ, it starts with the ICC, because ICC, of course, has the power to indict the commander-in-chief of the Rwanda Armed Forces, which, of course, would be Paul Kagame, the ruler of Rwanda. And then perhaps take that, not so much verdict, but take the indictment as an affirmation, and then go to the ICJ and seek monetary reparations at the ICJ. But I'm not aware, perhaps they have a concurrent action simultaneously ongoing at the ICJ, or perhaps it wants to do it a different way this time, to go through other regional courts, like the one you mentioned in the article here, the East African Court.
Court of Justice.
Get a determination there, go to the, where they have already gone to the African Court as well, and also get a ruling in their favor there, and then use those two rulings as an affirmation of their case, and then go to the ICJ and say, listen, we have a very strong case. The African courts have already determined the legitimacy of our claims, which perhaps would then make it easier for the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, to also rule in their favor. Maybe that's the approach they've chosen to take. But overall, I support it, of course. I think it's, you can't say you respect international law, right? And then you invade a neighboring country, you cause civilians to be killed, you plunder resources, and you just want to get away scot-free and keep doing that and repeating that. So I think it's a wise approach, and I think I would be shocked if they do not get favorable rulings, now that even major media that traditionally had been very soft on Rwanda with respect to the multiple invasions of Congo have been referring to this as an invasion. Even The Economist, reluctantly, ultimately, of course, would report Rwanda's denial, but then would elaborate with other examples to show that this indeed is an invasion. So it's taken, I think also, it seems also that the government in the Congo is also aware of that the media are now actually reporting this consistently as an invasion, so that they think the timing is also right for them to start the international effort in these courts to get some ruling in their favor. And then the final point I would like to make is that in the article that you read, there's nowhere did I hear the foreign minister of Rwanda rejecting it and saying, this is nonsense. There's no such invasion. It's not there. Instead, she's saying, you need to address the issue of the rebels that you are supporting against our government. So overall, it seems like that's an acknowledgement that indeed Congo has a legitimate claim.
So what would you say? Would you say, based on what you've just said now, would you say Rwanda has gained materially from its incursions, invasions, or what have you, into Congo?
No, it probably has gained to the extent that the resources that have been plundered is probably much more valuable than all the minerals generated within Rwanda itself.
But Rwanda doesn't have any.
Rwanda has some minerals. Rwanda, I think, grows coffee. It has its products. But my point is that what it has plundered exceeds the value of what it produces within its own country. So it's like, I know you love books, maybe you have 1,000 books. But if you were free to constantly go next door to your neighbor's house and come back with 3,000 books, that would exceed all the books you have in your entire life.
Just taking a quick break here on the African News Review podcast, but don't go anywhere. If you're enjoying our deep dive into the real stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern, we're here to debunk the myths and bring you the truth about Africa. Want to help spread the word? Share this podcast with your friends and leave us a review. It goes a long way in helping others discover the real Africa. Without further ado, let's get back to setting the record straight. I wish I could. And so where do you see this going in terms of outcome?
I think it's serious. I think ultimately, if it goes, because of course the ICJ has much more visibility.
Yeah.
Of course, we want our regional courts to eventually have that kind of visibility and coverage as well.
Okay.
I don't know if this story has been covered in other media, other international media. I don't know if the BBC covered it or Washington Post or New York Times. But I think if it had been action at the ICJ, but it's implied that there has already been action there because they say they want to expedite.
Yeah.
It means that a process already exists at the ICJ. And I imagine that one was covered when it was...
So you would say, you will conclude that it's likely that Rwanda would not only be in the dock, but internationally would become some sort of pariah, which...
Right, which is difficult because the government there sells itself on the conscience, right?
Yeah.
The global conscience.
Yeah.
Saying the world abandoned this country.
1994.
The Patriotic Front, the ones that actually, restored symbol of stability, humanity, whereas the rest of the world just watched as people are getting slaughtered. So that is the moral argument that it used to legitimize itself in power. So if you start losing that, then of course it becomes very difficult for you, because then increasingly the focus will be on, wait, what about these human rights issues? Not only in neighboring Congo, but within your country itself. Right now you can deflect that, and they've been deflecting that question by saying, you're talking to us about human rights when you just stood there when 1 million people were slaughtered. How dare you? So it seems like that argument had been very effective, but perhaps it's beginning to wear out a little bit.
Yeah.
Just seeing by before, for such a long time, this invasion would not be covered like an invasion for the longest time. But now you see there's some sort of confluence of all these media referring to it as invasion.
You seem to be having technical issues with the comrade, and do bear with us. So yes, I would continue while comrade tries to rejoin. And this issue is long-standing. With regards to the Rwandan genocide, it was on the watch of the United Nations, because at the time, the United Nations UNRWA, which was led by General Daniel Dolem, of the head of the Canadian forces. You were saying something, and I was just about to reiterate, to underscore the point you were making with regards to the Rwanda genocide. Can you hear me?
Yes. I had lost you for a second there.
Yeah. So I was just trying to reiterate the point you were making with regards to the responsibility Rwanda is placing on the world with regards to the Rwanda genocide, which was the United Nations failed in its responsibility. Right. The French were there on the ground, were also, undermining efforts. In fact, the United States refused to pick the tab because they had been burnt with their incursion in Somalia. People remember Black Hawk Down. And so Clinton at the time did not want to have any other American lives being lost on the African continent. Please continue.
Right. And of course, as we now know historically, the U.S. actually, okay, so fine. Rwanda had an issue that nobody can deny that, right? About the contestation over land, particularly.
Yes.
It's one of the most densely populated countries in the world, right? But the
again,
U.S.
these
also
are
played a
things
role.
you can't fault. So technical issues aside, yes, Rwanda continues to be a case, and the genocide was precipitated by the downing of the aircraft that killed the president of Rwanda and Burundi in one fell swoop. And the rest, as they know, is history. 800,000 people died in 100 days, and the world came together shortly thereafter to say never again. And that's with Kagame taking the reins of power in Kigali, capital of Rwanda. He became the conscience of the world, and started, his own little regime within Rwanda. And suffice to say, he's been aiding and abetting the M23 rebels who have been going into eastern side of Congo, principally the richest side of Congo in terms of its assets and what have you. And so Congo has now decided, enough is enough, has decided to take the legal route, because obviously there's no point fighting someone you cannot match in terms of resources, because Rwanda is armed, is one of the most well-armed military on the African continent. And so you were going to say?
Yeah. So I'm having some connectivity issues today. So I lost you for a couple of seconds now.
So I gave them a synopsis of what's transpired, the Rwandan genocide, the downing of the presidential aircraft, the coming of the IUF into Rwanda, seizing power, and the rest, as they say, is now history. The man has been in power now since 1994, and he's recently just gotten re-elected. And so now Congo is saying enough is enough. We cannot be plundered on the basis of, quote unquote, you want to chase rebels into, you want to chase rebel into Congo, and using that as a pretext.
And it uses two. First, it says it's chasing rebels. That's one aspect. And number two, it's saying, you are exterminating or indigenous Tutsi citizens of Congo. And they're the ones actually that have formed an army to resist being exterminated by you. So those were the two that they were using, and depending on which one they see media picking up on, that's the one
they will run with. Yeah, that's the one they will run with.
Right. At one time, they were pushing much more, we're coming to, not us, but these are rebels, indigenous rebels who are fighting to prevent being exterminated by you, the central government. So that one was played out for a while. And then, occasionally they also play, oh no, you're funding rebels to come and repeat the genocide of 1994. And that's, of course, is unacceptable. So whichever one has resonance at any particular stage
will be played.
Is the one that they play out. But as I say, this the legal approach now in international courts is going to cause a major problem. Should the Congolese get a favorable ruling, and the evidence seems on their side to get a favorable ruling.
Hopefully,
and ultimately, what it exposes is because of, as you and I know, the resources that are plundered from Eastern Congo, the factories do not exist within Rwanda. So these resources are exported to the industrialized countries in the West and some in Asian countries as well, which, of course, will expose their own culpability in the crimes that are being committed against the people of Congo. And that is why they should be very concerned, because the evidence would then be produced in these.
This is the point. This is the point at which I would love to recommend a book titled "Congo: The Plunder and Resistance," written by David Rettin, David Zendin, and Leo Zelik. It's, in fact, the blurb at the back says, since well before Henry Morgan Stanley fabled encounter with David Livingstone on the shore of Lake Tanganyika in the late 19th, a subsequent collaboration with King Leopold in Belgium, the looting of the country in mineral wealth has been insatiable.
Yes.
Basically, it's it's just wanton destruction. Anyway,
And here's the saddest thing. Maybe I can make this one. Mm-hmm. And it really ties up to all these issues that we discuss on a weekly basis. We don't have an African leader who has the moral stature to speak on these issues and boil it down simply to, this is just African humanity being crushed in the interest of profit for the industrialized countries. That is why we pretend there's even a debate whether Rwanda has invaded Congo. What kind of nonsense is that? We pretend it's a debate because who are the beneficiaries of the plunder? There are corporations in the European Western countries. And if an African leader with some stature could just put it in that context, a lot of it would be hard to pretend away. But can you point out to one single African leader who has that kind of stature, who's not tied with corruption, who's not tied with illegitimacy instead of, was this a democratically elected ruler? Is this a leader who is popular in his country? When you have a whole president of an important country like South Africa, being exposed as somebody who had stitched $4 million in cash in a sofa, think about it. So that goes back to leadership as well. We don't have the spokespersons of stature. We don't have a Mandela. We don't have the Julius Nyerere, or even a Thomas Sankara, So that is a very big betrayal of our people. So maybe that would be my final word on this talk.
Speaking of stature, Europe they're putting themselves in the dock. One wonders why. And the next story comes from The Guardian, and it's tied to Europe has questions to answer over migrant abuse in Tunisia, says MEPs and activists. The EU Commission says it will be sending independent observers to the country to investigate allegations of human rights violations. The European Commission can no longer ignore mounting evidence of gross human rights violations against migrants and refugees in Tunisia, says MEPs and activists. The EU has given millions of pounds to reduce migration from North Africa into Europe in a deal that pledges respect for human rights and piqued the interest of the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. How is this reduction achieved? People are incarcerated, women are raped, and children are dumped and left to die in the desert. This is happening on a daily basis, said David Yambio, spokesman for the NGO Refugees in Libya. Each agreement made with Tunisia and Libya is a death sentence for migrants and refugees, he added. The Guardian's investigations allege National Guards are colluding with smugglers to arrange migrant boat trips, as well as routinely robbing, beating, and abandoning women in the desert without food or water. The families of the Tunisian opposition politicians who are already funding a case against the Tunisian authorities are making a new submission to the International Criminal Court next week, demanding it open an investigation into the crimes against humanity against sub-Saharan migrants. So what's your take on the angle that this story has taken?
I was just looking up the population of Tunisia. think it's 13 million. All right, so you have a country with a population of 13 million. You have, what is the population of Nigeria? 200 plus million.
200 million and counting. Conservatively put, that is.
Right.
But
how can the so-called president of Nigeria not issue a serious statement on this type of abuse of Africans? And say, okay, Tunisia, you are on the African continent. You are considered to be an African country. And yet you are behaving in a way that even a European country would not get away with today in the 21st century. So what gives you that right? And make that a constant statement. Don't you think Tunisia would have to pay attention to it?
True.
So what is the purpose of Tinubu being president of a major country like Nigeria? Or the president of a country like South Africa? Or the African Union? Where's the African Union in all of this? You know, at the end of the day, as I said in the earlier segment, it goes back to a lack of leadership in Africa. Can you imagine you and I being a leader of an African country? We would just observe this kind of brutality and not issue a major statement, not even say we
ambassador coming to explain,
break off diplomatic relation with you. And even though we are talking about issues of sovereignty, this is so blatant that we might even consider military action against you. At the end of the day, we as melanated people in the world will only be respected to the extent that we make people know there has to be consequences against abusing us just because of our pigmentation. That to me is the most disappointing aspect of this story. Of course, the story contains the other element of the hypocrisy. And I like the fact that these people quoted are saying it. When did the EU know about these abuses?
True.
Because obviously they knew about the abuses, ignored it, and continued funneling these millions of dollars or euros to the Tunisian government. So long as you can interdict these Africans, prevent them from coming to Europe, you are not seeing anything. You are not hearing anything. You do what you need to do. That's, of course, is the unwritten part of the agreement. Although they knew what was going on. Otherwise, why would they mention respecting human rights?
True.
In the agreement itself? Does that just come out of nowhere?
No.
Well, it comes out of knowledge that something is happening. So, of course, this is a very good case that they'll file. The spokespersons and their activists have filed to the ICJ because the admission is already within the agreement itself. You put in that clause because you were aware that something was going on. Right?
Yep.
And you continue to send money. And now the Guardian has come up with this major investigation. And they've yielded the evidence, you see. So let's see what type of ruling they get out of it. But to me, the bigger aspect, and I hope the Guardian pursues this as a follow-up story. Ask Tinubu, ask Ramaphosa in South Africa, ask the leaders of these countries. Why is there no major statement on this issue? But if they really don't care about their own citizens, of course we know the answer.
Yep.
And it's very scary, very chilling and disappointing. that we have rulers who have no empathy or compassion for fellow Africans. Very disturbing.
I mean, to say they have no empathy is an understatement in itself, because what you have is, as Ayikuyama says in Remembering a Dismembered Continent, little leaders who have been put in charge of tiny plantations, and they have to report to their paid masters from time to time. And so they would not go against what the said paid masters said. Again, we're having technical issues, but do bear with us. Brother Milton will be back in a second. So again, when we look at this story, what we can read into it is, it says, the Guardian's investigation alleged National Guards are colluding with smugglers to arrange migrant boat trips, as well as routinely robbing, beating, and abandoning women and children in the deserts without food. There was a huge uproar, again covered by the Guardian, I think late last year, where the case of pregnant women without food were left in the desert by Tunisian border guards after they've been expelled from Tunisia. Now, the question I would want to pose to Brother Milton is, why now, though? Why now?
In terms of the timing of the story,
yes,
or the interest?
Yes, the timing of the story and also the case itself. Why now?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, actually.
Because if you've
I think I may have to defer to your judgment on this particular.
So, my reading through the article,
because you're right, it's been going on.
Yeah,
it's been going on. Even the story says somewhere this is predictable, and of course, you and I can trace it back to even during the war against, Gaddafi's government. These abuses were going on till then. So the timing, unless there's some political issues that's ongoing in Europe right now, with respect to the European Parliament itself, it's hard to really, for me to pinpoint. So, even in Tunisia itself, it's been an issue for the last 3 or 4 years, right? So,
So in Tunisia is a case of one, there is going to be a presidential election soon. And the way the incumbent has been running things is going to be returned nearly all unopposed, because most of the opposition are in jail if they're not in hiding. That's one. Then two is the fact that the case itself has been taken to the International Criminal Court. And what Europe does not want is who has been facilitating this abuse materially, and the fingers being pointed to them. That is really a scary prospect for them. So I think that's one of the reasons why, or possibly multiple reasons why, the case is now being brought. It's like, we know, but we're now doing our utmost best to ensure that this does not become the matter going forward.
And that we are tied to it in terms of liability and culpability.
Yeah, of course. And so, we go on to our next story, which comes from the Associated Press. It's titled, again, this story looks at the attacks by Islamic extremists in the Sahel. The favorite subject matter of the Western press. It reads, attacks by Islamic extremists are rampant in African Sahel. Here is what we know about them. I've highlighted some aspects of it that I think would stir the conversation Over the last decade, the region has been shaken by extremist uprisings and military coups. Two Sahelian nations, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, are now ruled by military leaders who have taken power by force on the pledge of providing more security to citizens. The security situation in Sahel has worsened since the juntas took power, analysts said, with a record number of attacks and record number of civilians killed by both Islamic fighters and government forces. The main two groups operating in the region are Al-Qaeda-linked militant group Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam al-Mumin, JNMI, and the Islamic State in the Sahel. Over the last year, the JNMI has strengthened its presence in Mali and Burkina Faso by becoming a more coherent political grouping. The local population supports JNM more than ISIS-affiliated groups, said analyst Shatau Shankar of the Economics Intelligence Unit. They have integrated local rebel groups which have close community ties. Unlike the JNMI, the Islamic State in the Sahel is a loose coalition of anti-government forces that is much less entrenched politically, he said. They are much more dominant in the Lake Chad region. In addition, there are a number of local militias on the ground which are not affiliated with ISIS or Al-Qaeda, as violence has exploded between rival ethnicities and local self-defense groups, resulting in a self-perpetuating spiral of violence. Your initial thoughts before I continue.
All right. So first of all, coming from a Western perspective, right?
Yeah, go on.
Obviously, you know what they want to avoid. So they want to dictate the terms that we discussed in previous conversations.
Yeah.
So this short history. So where does the history begin? The history begins with these military leaders, these officers taking power.
Yeah.
In Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger. Mm-hmm. That's where the story begins. Very conveniently, right? The story avoids the destruction of Gaddafi's government that we discussed on numerous occasions by NATO, by the West, led by the United States and France. And of course,
Britain?
And Britain. It's not by coincidence. That is when all these groups became really empowered with sophisticated weapons. That's where the narrative begins. But by including that narrative, then of course, the Western culpability would be embraced in these stories. And then their obligation and responsibility. It does not mean that you should base your troops in these countries. If they don't want you there, there are other ways you can still support the effort to resist these forces that are armed with weapons that you help unleash when you destroy the government of Libya. Correct?
Yes.
So that is a component that has to be included in this narrative and as part of the solution. They must not be allowed to wash their hands off their obligation to help restore these governments to where they were before these now super armed groups were unleashed beginning in 2011 under the destruction of Gaddafi's government. So that's one aspect. The second aspect, of course, which only we can insist on, which is also implied in the article, is actually the economic aspect. A lot of these struggles, and now when you talk about some of these groups getting some local support, if the youth in these areas, and I've always used this argument to even for even Nigeria, right? If young people in these areas were gainfully employed or had hope for being eventually gainfully employed in whatever productive, activities,
pursuits,
they would not have the incentive to be joining these groups. They don't join these groups because they are convinced by some higher ideological or philosophical argument. No, they join because they know I will probably end up wearing, nice uniforms. I may end up having nice boots. I will have communications devices, if I become a leader within the units in this group, and I will have weapons. And without weapons, I can demand anything I want and need.
True.
You see? And that's always going to be a big aspect of all of this. And obviously, there's a correlation between this. It's like the neglect. You can even look at some of our impoverished neighborhoods within these Western societies. Yeah, we have them right here in the United States. You have them right there in Britain.
Of course. Of course.
Where there's a strong correlation between economic deprivation, lack of training, lack of opportunities, lack of investment, lack of job prospects. Young people don't just wake up one day and say, you know what, today I don't feel like going for my training program. Let me get a gun. Or today I don't feel like going to work. Let me get out my gun. So at the end of the day, we have to make sure we always look at the economic aspect as well. Otherwise, the way the stories are projected in Western media is that it's sort of like something pathological. It's a behavioral problem. Africans have an issue in not having the capacity or interest in building stable, prosperous societies, So I think one sub-headline says, here's what we know about this conflict. I think, a better approach would be, here's what we don't know. Because then you will
here's what we did.
Exactly. That is our role to bring out. Here's what they did to get us to where we are today.
Okay. One more part from that. This part here is flat. I don't even know what to say. After coming to power, all three juntas left the Economic Community of West African States, the nearly 50-year-old regional bloc known as ECOWAS, and created their own security partnership, the Alliance of Sahel States, in September. They cut ties with the traditional allies, ousted French and military forces, and in itself sought new security ties with Russia. There is a huge security vacuum after the withdrawal of French and American military from the region, which cannot be filled by Russia. And troops from the Wagner Group, the Russian private military company present in the regions, are being financed by the junta government. Shankar added, with fewer financial resources. I mean, this piece alone here says a lot. First and foremost, they cut ties with the traditional Western allies, ousting the French and the military forces. Is that a given that you should have foreign forces on your soil?
No, in French, they are traditional colonizers of this country. You see? But, that is the role of the media. So an uninitiated person would not know that these countries were former French colonies.
Yeah.
Because it's not mentioned anywhere in this article. You see?
And
of course, by mentioning it, you would allow somebody who is uninitiated and yet is interested in this topic to know that, so France was the former colonizer of this country. So perhaps there's a reason why they don't want French troops in those countries. Just like even before the U.S. became a global power, at some point, there was a reason why they didn't want British troops anymore to be in the United States.
True.
That's why they kicked them in a war of independence, right?
Yeah.
And even though they remained relatively weak compared to Britain, they did not want the British to reintroduce troops in the U.S. after the War of Independence. And when they tried, they were crushed again, you see? So all these things need to be put in perspective. So our role is to fill in these gaps and holes that are blatantly omitted by the Western corporate media. And they're correct in the sense that the Wagner, Russia will not be able to fund and to adequately support resisting these groups that are fighting the central government. But that does not translate into, therefore, which is, of course, is what the article is trying to imply. Therefore, they must bring back the French and they must bring back the United States. Yeah. So, of course, we rule that out. Just because Russia cannot effectively sustain them, it doesn't mean that we can bring you back in, because after all, you are not doing it either. It needs much more Africa participation. They're in the right direction in the sense that they are the three countries have come together to try to do it together. Hopefully they can get more African countries to support them in this effort. Of course, it's difficult since we have a number of other conflicts in other parts of the continent.
True. And so, speaking of conflicts, but this time of intellectual nature, the Commonwealth is going to be holding their meeting, the first one since King Charles, His Majesty King Charles, became King of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. And one matter has been up for debate, and the story comes from the Times. It's titled, "The Commonwealth Chief Candidates All Back Slavery Reparations." All three contenders to replace Baroness Scotland as Secretary General want Britain to make amends for colonialism. The fraught debate about reparations for slavery and colonialism is likely to dominate the King's first meeting with Commonwealth leaders since he ascended the throne. The organization, which has 56 members, have long resisted tackling the legacy of slavery in a public forum, but a reckoning with its roots in the British Empire seems unavoidable next month, with the election of a new Secretary General. All three candidates running to succeed Baroness Scotland have backed the idea of making amends for slavery and colonialism. The King is the ceremonial head of the Commonwealth, whose members include West African and Caribbean countries affected by the slave trade. About 10 million people were enslaved by Britain and European nations between the 15th and the 19th century and sent to work on plantations across the Atlantic in the Caribbean and the Americas. So the candidates are Mamadou Tangara, a Gambian, Joshua Setipa, former trade minister and industry minister in Lesotho, and last but not the least, where is he? What's the other candidate? The name escapes me. They are second, Botchway. So the lady is the first one. Shirley Botchway, former the Foreign Affairs Minister of Ghana. So all three. So your take on this new, it's not a new development, but a new way of speaking truth to power.
Right. So obviously it speaks to where we have come, and it's a long way when you have candidates running for Secretary General of a Commonwealth organization saying they support reparations for enslavement, African people, and colonialism. And clearly one of them is going to end up being taking that position.
Yep.
So that's interesting in itself. Obviously, some years ago, this could possibly not be the case. So it shows you how much the conversation has become a part of so-called mainstream conversation, the issue of reparations for enslavement and for colonialism, that the issue of justice now has more resonance than it had in the past. That, of course, is one step in the right direction. It doesn't tell you whether we are near to getting it or not, but still it's a positive
development.
Something positive which we have to acknowledge. And then, of course, the whole name of the organization itself, the Commonwealth, or the Commonwealth of Nations, which is, of course, not the case. You cannot have Commonwealth of formerly colonized countries with the former principal colonizer Britain without having a transfer of that wealth. So how is the wealth common? Which wealth? Whose wealth is common? You know?
Yours is mine, mine is mine.
Yeah, so it's almost like you are exonerating that history of colonization and enslavement and plunder by accepting that being part of an organization called the Commonwealth of Nations with the former principal colonizing power. So that to me has always been an issue, you know. Are you moving toward Commonwealth? Where is the evidence? You know, it's not there. So perhaps it's reassuring that we are now having a conversation. In terms of, you know, reparations for enslavement, for colonization, that is an issue that is not really just philosophical or theoretical. It needs to be addressed. Otherwise, we're going to go through generation upon generation dealing with the same issues, you know, that prior generations have been, you know, dealing or not dealing with, addressing or not addressing for the past several generations, correct?
Yep.
Since the official enslavement was ended, since slavery was formally abolished, since colonialism was formally ended, you know, that has been done on paper primarily, but redressing the historical devastation that occurred, that's an issue that's always been, you know, the Americans like saying, punting the ball, you know, you kick it away forward for somebody else to handle. So that I think if can it be done? Yes, I think it can be done. I think you have to deal with the people that have the money, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the approach has been in terms of dealing directly with the governments. And I agree, governments need to take the responsibility and obligation in terms of addressing the issues of compensation and reparations, right?
Yep.
But then again, in these Western countries, such as Britain, such as the United States, corporations play the dominant role in the economy. Corporations generate significant revenue in these countries. I think the approach should be directed at government, but at corporations as well. There's no reason why corporations should not agree to some form of taxation, which would be directly related to the issue of reparations for enslavement and colonialism. Many of these corporations, as Walter Rodney showed in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, are directly connected. Their profits and their growth can be directly traced to the participation, the role they play in slavery.
Yeah.
So, but I'm not just saying identify only those corporations who were linked directly to enslavement and colonialism. Every major corporation really is somehow a beneficiary, nonetheless, of that relationship. So why can there not be a form of taxation that, of course, would be dependent on how big these corporations are? And it's not a crippling form of taxation. It's a form that is acceptable.
Okay.
And it's for a duration that will last for a certain duration, but with a finite end goal as well. So it will generate a substantial amount of revenue because the period is stretched. So we're not saying, oh, pay this amount of tax next year so that all the funds required for reparations can be generated in a year or two. No, we're not saying this. Stretch the period out so that the funds are being generated. And you're addressing the issue of reparations so that if it's over a 15-year period, over a 20-year period, substantial funds would be generated over that time frame, and substantial intervention can be accomplished to address some of these issues of economic inequity that still plague our communities. So that in 15 to 20 years, we cannot be having the same conversation over and over and over again. So that now it really benefits all sides, right? We're addressing issues that everybody knows needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
At the same time, we're also addressing the concern by the beneficiaries that when is this conversation going to stop? It's not going to stop by ignoring it. I can tell you that if you're a beneficiary, I can tell you right now, it's not going to stop just by ignoring it. So is it not incumbent upon all sides to keep exploring for a mechanism that will address the issue that is acceptable?
Okay. The idea you just laid out has actually been tried, tested, and worked, but flipped on its head. In the late 1800s, following the abolition of slavery.
Yes, I know where you're going with this. And it just confirms that what I'm saying, that yes, it does work after all. And it's worked for one side. Yeah, but go ahead, finish.
Following the abolition of slavery, an act of parliament was moved in which about 20 to 25 million pounds then was shared out as compensation for lost property to the enslavers. And churches, corporations, individuals pooled. We will be the none wiser were it not for a tweet in February of 2015 that went out, boom, and the tweet said, and I quote, "We should congratulate ourselves for finally paying off the tax on paying off our, our bill on slavery." Now, the fact that every Black person within the country was also taxed is the mind-blowing part of it.
Right. And we're not even going that radical. We're not even that radical. We're saying tax corporations because corporations generate significant revenue. And now you've reminded me, you've just reminded me that the model actually works. So now let's apply that model so that we can move the conversation to other topics.
And speaking of model, if people want to read with regards to what transpired, there's a beautiful book out there titled The Interest. It's Michael Taylor's The Interest, how the British establishment resisted the abolition of slavery. And it's a fantastic book to have.
Excellent.
And mine is worse for wear because of all the writing in there. It's like, wow, this actually happened. And, because people actually stood up in Parliament to say, you don't just ask me to lose all my wealth. And they voted and agreed that this is what we're going to take. This is what we're going to charge the state in order for the abolition to actually go. It wasn't altruistic. They were compensated. And during
the right thing.
Yeah. And during the George Floyd thing, lots of companies within the UK came out and said, and chief amongst them was Lloyd's of London, the maritime insurance of those times,
right,
saying we need to do, and, pledges were made, but who took them to task with regards to those pledges?
Right. So the sentiment can be pushed further. And if we have 10, then 20 serious major corporations involved in this approach. Because let's be honest, I mean, somebody might say, oh, why are they framing it that way? This is something that is owed, something that should be demanded, something that needs to happen, something that we must make happen. I don't know that any of us have that power to impose those conditions that would make Britain or the United States cut a check. So here's the check. You're right. What happened was wrong. They know what happened is wrong. We don't have the capacity to compel them to do the right thing. But if corporations can be made involved, because corporations, we can actually organize to impact their bottom lines, you see? So they actually should have incentive in having this issue redressed in a very serious and committed way. So that, to me, seems to be a much more viable and effective approach. If we had formed a United States of Africa in 1962-63, at the time when Nkrumah was really pushing it at the continental level, at the Organization of African Unity meetings, the conversation would be much more different today. You see, we would have a global African power with leadership that can say something that would have global impact, like the president of China speaks, has impact. The prime minister of India, has impact. You see, where is that African leader today? There's not a single one who can speak and have impact. When was the most recent issue that an African leader spoke on that had global resonance? It was the issue of the Israeli genocide in Gaza. Yeah. And that was the foreign minister.
Foreign minister,
of South Africa, Naledi Pandor, who had global impact and global resonance. And of course, she's no longer a foreign minister. And I don't think that's by accident, by the way.
Of course not. 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 And again, it goes to Africa's way of keeping records. Africa has a very short memory. And we don't, South Africa is a case in point. You've gone through apartheid, you've experienced it, you've come out of it, only to go back and embrace the same ethos. But this time, you've inverted, the mindset. Now it's all about the money. The people who stood with you are now, quote unquote, your enemy because you don't want to lose power. Because if you wanted power to resonate with the people, to stay with the people, you would have formed a coalition with EFF, and Naledi Pandor would have been allowed to finish that matter with the ICC.
Right.
But because you wanted power, not at the expense of the people, you went with the money class.
Yes, but where is the African BBC that would shape the narrative. Conversation the way you just laid it out?
Yeah.
Where is the African Al Jazeera? Where is the African New York Times, CNN, Washington Post? Where is it? It does not exist. So people like Ramaphosa, people like Tinubu, they have no major media outlet that would help to check them. And while at the same time elevating the consciousness of our people. Saying we as African people cannot forget. Yes, you may be going through economic hardship right now, but it's not because of people coming to work there from Zimbabwe or Nigeria or Kenya or Uganda. No, look at the wealth inequality within South Africa right now.
Of course.
How is it possible that the country where people like Elon Musk made their fortune and are still holding on to the disproportionate share of the fortune, what does somebody from Zimbabwe have to do with that? If he has a job, whether he's cleaning the streets, whether he's working in a restaurant, whether he's working...
How's it going to impact your life? Yeah.
How's that? Or as an engineer or as a doctor, how is he destructive relative to somebody who's still living on the interest from the wealth, from the mining industry? And your ancestors are the ones who built, the wealth through their cheap labor. You never had, and we've been discussing this tax for reparations. Where is the apartheid reparations taxation? Where is that? That's the conversation that they should have initiated in 1990s.
94. Yeah.
Right? Or 1994. Correct. When the ANC had that moral stature. You see? Had that materialized, some of that money could have addressed the economic impoverishment that Africans endure today in South Africa as we speak. So now how are you going to bring that conversation now that you're in such a weak position that in order to form government, you had to partner with the
very people you
apartheid light, apartheid light party.
I mean, it's
mind-boggling.
Seriously mind-boggling.
But since we know the importance of media in letting people think, in letting people make much more informed choices, bringing up these topics, reminding our sister and brothers in South Africa to go back to YouTube and watch Steve Biko interview, and you learn within half an hour that Biko predicted what would happen. And armed with that knowledge, you might take a different position in trying to transform your societies. So that's the value of our conversations here.
And speaking of value, one final story, we go to the BBC, the mothership. And the story reads, the journey that helped save Nigeria's art for the nation. It's written by Adaobi Trisha Wabi. The Nigerian National Museum in Lagos sits in the city like a respected but unloved relative. It somehow exudes importance but remains largely unvisited. This is perhaps because the concept of a museum is based on a colonial idea, stuffing cabinets full of exoticized objects removed from the context that gave them any meaning. Olugbile Holloway, who was appointed early this year to head the commission that runs the National Museum, is keen to change this. He wants to take the artifacts on the road and get them seen back where they once belonged. How organically African is this concept of a museum? Or has the ideology kind of been superimposed on us? He asked me. Maybe the conventional model of a nice building with the artifacts and write-ups maybe isn't what's going to work in this part of the world. Established in 1957, 3 years before independence, the museum houses objects from across the country, including Ife bronze, terracotta heads, Bini brass plaques, and ivories, and Ibibio masks. What is your take with regards to the issue of museums and curating art for the public?
No, I think so. I think it's part of education. It's part of our history. We should take control of it. I've always, had a very keen interest on this issue. It's part of recovering our history.
Okay.
It's were it not for the phenomenal Benin art, for example.
Yeah.
Were it not for the artifacts of Kemet, who would believe that we had attained such a high level of quote-unquote civilization? And I put in quotation because I sort of agree with Walter Rodney that when you start talking civilization, then it becomes a relative term. Because you're declaring outright that we had attained some level which is superior relative to yours. So he says we should talk about civilization. We should talk about high levels of culture. But people are not familiar when you put it that way. That's why I also put civilization quotation.
Civilization. Right? Okay.
But look at the Benin art, the bronze art, It's almost impossible to believe that human beings would produce that kind of sophistication. Correct?
Of
course, it's important. There you go. It's important that our young people know that not this was us, this is us. We have the capacity to produce this level of sophistication. You see?
Okay.
And there's a reason why, historically, the Europeans who conquered Africa either destroyed or made you destroy the art and then took some back with them because they saw the aesthetic quality and sophistication, that they took it back and indeed displayed it. And here's the contradiction, right? The two contradictions I want to talk about. One, these people are inherently, genetically lazy and incompetent, right? African peoples. That's the stereotype, right?
Yeah.
But even though they're lazy and sophisticated, let's kidnap millions of them so they can generate wealth for us.
Yeah.
In the new world with their laziness, right?
With their laziness, yeah.
Okay, that's one contradiction. The second one, the lack of intelligence and sophistication. But on the other hand, let's take the sophisticated artifacts that they've been producing since maybe 10,000 years ago. We go back to even prior to unified Kemet, right? Which is 5,200 years. But the artifacts going way before, unified ancient Egypt or Kemet.
Yeah.
Let's take some of that. And not hide it in the basement, but display it in prominent locations that they call museums. And then you have people coming to see and they're admiring, how could this, wow. And yet they're supposed to believe on the same one part of their brain is supposed to believe that these are really backward savages.
Yeah.
But suspend that part while this part of the brain is admiring the work that they produce. It's amazing what kind of intellectual gymnastics that the European mind has been conditioned to be able to accomplish. You see? And it works so well that even our own African people sometimes have difficulty believing that our ancestors were able to produce that.
Yeah.
See, because they've been informed and told for such a long time that you're not worthy, you're not intelligent, you're not worthy, you're not intelligent. See? So by us actually embracing this concept, it's like you're sharing books. So people read books, even at the most local village level. People have access to books, or maybe now you have computers, even in places with no electricity, that can generate power through sunlight, solar energy. They can access books through computers. There's no reason why they should not be able to access artifacts that we've produced historically. Take it to them. Let them embrace it. You're taking samples. So now young people are inspired that eventually one day, if I make it to Lagos, I'm going to go to that museum. We don't even have to call it a museum. We can make a different name that is more organic and Africa-centric. Okay. One day, if I make it to Johannesburg, I'm going to go to that museum. To Kampala, from my village back somewhere, I'm going to head to that museum. Nairobi, I'll go there. So I'm not against that. In fact, I wrote an op-ed some years ago when the issue of Ethiopian artifacts was a big issue. In fact, in the case of Ethiopia, as you know, they even stole the son of the emperor.
Of the emperor.
Right? Allimadi, and they brought him all the way to England. You know.
Where he
they've never returned the remains, because I'm convinced they don't even know where the remains are, personally, you know. And the artifacts, the jewelry that they looted from Ethiopia, you know, that needs to be returned. And I propose that we should also have a museum in one African country, a Pan-African museum, regardless of the individual ones you have in your country. One Pan-African one, where each African country contributes some of their best historical artifacts, and we keep it there. And the ones that are being returned now, the ones stolen that are in Europe, United States, we also take some of it there. And then there's no reason why that Pan-African museum may be located in Addis, since that's where we have the headquarters of the African Union.
Yeah.
There's no reason why we would not then have these tourists coming from all over the world, right? Yeah. Now they're going to the Louvre in Paris, or the Met in New York,
or the British Museum in
London. There's no reason why they would not be coming to Addis Ababa. And that is generating significant revenue that is actually shared to all these African countries, who, of course, contribute some amount to maintain the museum on an annual basis. But they will get more than their returns, you know. Because now all these artifacts in one location, you don't have to fly to the museum in Bonn or Berlin, New York,
or Belgium,
London, Belgium, right? Paris, you name it. So that is actually an idea that I support, because it's part of the education process of reawakening our people. I see how young people are reawakened when they encounter anti-job for the first time. By the end of the semester, they're not the same youth anymore. Now they're sharing the education with their siblings, sharing the education with their parents, with their friends because they feel empowered. They realize, whoa, our history does not begin with slavery.
Yeah.
No, not only that. In fact, we, as melanated people, existed before all other forms of humanity. How can you feel inferior after that knowledge is in your mind? So that's why we need to. It will only allow our people to start accomplishing again, because there's something that went wrong. If we were able to build ancient Kemet, what's the problem today?
True.
It means we are not elevating our potential, to the max. Of course, many of us are. There are many Africans who are scoring spectacular achievements, but those are being treated as unique,
individual,
or special. But in fact, my argument is that no, they're not. They're not. So reinstill that spirit of nothing can stop me, and you can do that by connecting them to that history. And artifacts, those are our books. They play a large role,
in reawakening the memory of
reawakening the memory of their past, so we can understand our position today, as Babu said, right?
Yeah.
So that we can then take the direction we need to take for the future.
Thank you. We've come to, with that, inspiring end, we've come to another informative African News Review. For those who are listening and you want to share this, you can share it on YouTube, and also there will be an audio version on all podcast platforms, and do download from there on. And Brother Comrade, final thought?
Luta continua, support us as we try to spread the word, help spread the word as well. And at the end of the day, we will prevail. Once our people know where we came from, they know why we are where we are today, and then they are inspired to take us to the next level, where I have every confidence that we will reach. Whether we will be there at that time or not, that's irrelevant. We will provide our contribution to that journey.
True. And yes, from me, keep listening, keep watching, read them books, read the newspapers with an Afrocentric view.
Yes.
And again, until next week, it is good evening from me, and see you all next week. That's a wrap for this week on the African News Review podcast. We hope you are leaving with a clearer, more truthful picture of Africa. Remember, every story has another side, and we're here to uncover it. Don't forget to join us next Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we continue to challenge the narratives and reclaim Africa's voice. If you've enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeing Africa for what it truly is.